Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a good Friday. I'm Greg Swartz. I'm the director of the Water of Life. I'm also the host of what has become a regular weekly chat that we do here every Friday, 1 p.m. my time here in California, 9 p.m. In the UK, and you can calculate the rest yourself. But this is what we've been calling Big Man We Dram Live. And each week we have a guest, talk about some different unique aspects of whiskey. And our guests are all chosen based on the different roles they play within the whiskey world, not just in Scotland. Last week we did a thing in Norway, so we're real, and Australia, and we have a couple other ones that are not going to be in Scotland. But this week I'm very excited because we have Mr. John McCheyne with us, who is the global brand ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And I am both a member, and I was just telling him something of an addict of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society whiskeys. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome John in.
Hi,
Hello.
Greg. Hi, folks.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for sharing
pleasure.
your Friday evening. I wasn't exaggerating when I say I've become pretty addicted to the outturn emails I get, twice a month from the SMWS, and I every time I think I always go through this process. I'm going to look, but I'm not buying anything this time, and then. Up to 20 minutes later, I go to the kitchen and get my wallet.
Absolutely, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit? I know I said your job title, but can you tell us a little bit more about your journey into whiskey and your role?
Sure, yes, Greg. I grew up in Glasgow, and my father and all of his brothers and my mother's brothers would gather periodically as a family, and they would all share whiskey. In that convivial atmosphere, family atmosphere. Back then, it was all blended, though. But they enjoyed it so much that I just couldn't wait till I was old enough to be a part of it. So when I first started drinking whiskey, when I was old enough, I was drinking blended whiskey too. And it was a visit probably to Laphroaig distillery in 1983, where there was no visitor centres or nothing like that, but I managed to convince Laphroaig to take me and two of my friends in a little tour. And down in the warehouse, we were given a couple of drams of single cask whiskey, and then we're told that we can't buy that because it all gets blended together into the single malt versions of Laphroaig. And I thought, oh, you big tease, because we loved it. And a few months later, I found out a society in Edinburgh had formed to focus on single cask, single malt. I joined as soon as I could, and that was me. I was a member for almost since the beginning. And in 2007, when they were looking for members to become ambassadors to start spreading the word through tasting events to other members, I threw my hat in the ring and was picked for my area where I live. Other ambassadors were in other areas. And gradually over the years, I did more and more until I've been doing stuff around the world for the SMWS for the last 6 or 7 years.
And during that time, the SMWS seems to have just grown exponentially, not just...
It's a fantastic story, Greg. As you know, the founder was a chap called Philip Hills, known as Pip Hills. And he's written a book just last year called The Founder's Tale, which is worth reading. He started a single cask, single malt whiskey business in 1983. Just think about the circumstances. We were in a global recession. There were distilleries closing all over the place. And he was going to start up a single cask, single malt business. No one had heard of single cask back then. Everybody thought he was a madman. And he carried on anyway. He says he nearly went bankrupt twice. But here we are all these years later in 30 countries around the world, members all across the globe. But we've developed since then. We started off with single cask, single malt Scotch. But we've developed into a situation where we've innovated over the years. We are now doing whiskies from other countries. We're doing other single cask spirits, all in the attempt to give our members as wide a range of flavours to enjoy and explore as they can. So we're doing extra maturation casks, we're doing blended malts, but the main thing that we do is still single cask, single malt Scotch.
I have one of the blended malts. I have a battle axe. Right?
Oh,
That's
yes.
I think I've got 7 or 8 bottles. I just spent the winter back east, at my in-laws, and I kept, as I said, I'm addicted, so I kept buying bottles. So I wound up having a collection there and a collection here, and because they're single casks, they don't overlap, which is kind of tragic for me.
Well, I think yeah, that's right, Greg. Well, one of the things which is a shame about single cask is that when it gets to the end, that's it at the end. There is no more. But it's the joy and the unfortunate thing about it as well, you know.
When we were doing the Burns Night thing back in January, one of the things that Rachel Barry said to us, and actually I believe she didn't say it live on the Q&A. She and I were talking before we went live, it has really become something of a whiskey mantra to me, and it's triply applicable to single cask whiskey, which is, I was talking about getting really close to the bottom of a bottle and not ever wanting to kind of let it go. And she said, if you really commit yourself to the idea that it is the journey, it's not the destination, finish it off, be happy that it existed, and know in your heart you'll find another one.
Sometimes I think, well, Greg, sometimes I hold on to bottles as well, but sometimes I hold on to the bottle, not because there's still some left in it, but because of the number or the name or the distillation date. Because we can tell the exact distillation date on a single cask, single malt, sometimes there is an extra element of thrill to that for a person for whom it's a particular date in their lives. So I've held on to a couple for that reason. But I agree with you. There is sometimes you just want to leave a little bit in there, but really we should move on to the next one.
Yeah. That's easier said than done, I realize, but one of the things that if anyone watching, and I see that loads of people are saying hello to us from Jens Freimuth from Germany. Good. And people from Los Angeles, Linda in Glasgow, a friend of mine, Kevin in Ireland. Hello, everyone. We'll get to some questions in a couple of minutes. I see a few questions popping up, but one of the things that Charlie McCheyne says in the film, there's actually a scene that has a name in the film called "Who on Earth Would Want to Drink Malt Whiskey?" And that scene is about how the Urquhart family really believed in single malts when no one else did, and George Urquhart would save whiskeys, and people thought he was crazy. And I feel like the next step of that is single cask whiskey. You know, it was first people drank blends and they thought, well, who would want to drink a single malt? And now that's become pretty standard. So now it's like, now the extreme of that is the single cask. There's a sort of ephemera to it.
I mean, if you look back in the history of whiskey, Scotch whiskey, over a few hundred years, it started off single malt and then it became blended. And blended was the thing that propelled Scotch around the world to become the number one type of whiskey. And all of a sudden, probably back, well, we know Glenfiddich started bottling single malt very commercially in 1963, but really it's taken off since then, probably during the 80s and 90s. Single malt became a big thing. But we have to remember, Greg, that blended is still the category which is most drunk around the world. Still 85% of all Scotch whisky drunk is blended, although malt is growing and growing. But we always have to balance the need for the blended whiskies, because that is the major whiskey drunk around the world and what Diageo exists for, really, you know. So, yes, it's an incredible thing. I just think in the future, we will see a growth in single malt consumption. People around the world now are drinking less, but drinking better. That kind of movement is really gathering pace. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, a huge proportion of our young people, not a huge, quite a significant proportion, maybe 28, 29% of the young adults between 18 and 25 do not drink alcohol at all. They're trying to live healthier lifestyles. So how come that the sales of whiskey continue to grow? It's because people are drinking better whiskey, I believe, you know. I mean, in the UK, 70% of malt whiskey is bought in supermarkets. And 50% of that is for someone else as a gift. So there's still quite a small proportion of whiskey drinkers in the world who are experimenting with different malts and growing their flavours. And I think that will continue. But also remember that over 200 odd years, the Scotch whisky industry hasn't been on an constant upward plane. It's been like that, you know. And at the moment, we're in a boom, apart from the trouble with American tariffs and things in the last couple of years. But I mean, we just have to watch economically what will happen in the future. But there's more distilleries, expansion of distilleries. So there's going to be, hopefully, more and more single malt, single cask available in the future for people coming into the category.
You know, I mean, I really feel like the growth of single malts and then even more so the growth of single cask whiskeys is going to start to put pressure on independent bottlers to be able to source stuff, especially in like how brand aware companies are and protective of their brands they are. And I realized that calling the Scotch Malt Whisky Society an independent bottler is like calling an iPhone a telephone. I mean, that doesn't really sum up what it does, but I know you guys are so much more than that. But at the end of the day, that's the sort of the heritage of it, the way the whiskey is sourced. I mean, have you guys felt that pinch? I mean, are there
over the years, since 1983, we've actually bottled from distilleries that are more difficult to get these days than they used to be. I mean, one of the good things that happened to Pip when he started in 1983 is that there was lots of single casks available. Because of the recession, there was lots of casks available because the blenders weren't taking them. So I think that there must be a squeeze, I think, on some what you would call independent bottlers. We're probably a whiskey maker as opposed to an independent bottler. But it doesn't seem to be. There seems to be more and more independent bottlers still getting casks. And I think it's the Scotch whisky industry has always been a kind of industry where people are prepared to talk and share all over the centuries, really. And we have got so many great contacts in the whiskey business that we are able to supply our own casks to get fills and then to mature it ourselves. And we'll develop that even further as the years go on. We might even get to the point where we might even specify our new make spirit flavours so that we can bring it back and mature it in our own casks. So the future for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is certainly very promising and rosy, exciting, really.
It's interesting because there's someone asked recently. I was in a tasting, I think it was a signatory tasting, and someone asked, "Do any independent bottlers or independent whiskey makers have their own sort of flavor profile?" And you know, and that's pretty hard to establish. I mean, I think it would be almost impossible unless they were only going to release one spirit. But there's certainly a taste profile. You know, there's certainly that emerges over time. The people who run it have a certain taste, or their members have a certain taste.
Well, I would kind of dispute that principle, Greg, for the same reason as you, in that if you go to every distillery in Scotland, every malt whisky distillery in Scotland, the taste of new make spirit will be different every time. So then, and the distilleries know themselves, if they take the same new make spirit on the same day and put it into the same type of cask and mature them next to each other for a number of years at the same place in a warehouse, they'll taste differently. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how, really, an independent bottler could actually focus on a particular flavour profile unless they chose a particular few distilleries, a particular way of maturation and all of that. And why you would want to do that, I'm not really sure. I mean, as you know, we've got 12 different flavour profiles. Yeah. And we're able, with the same new make spirit, by different maturation regimes, to create 6, 7, 8 different flavour profiles from the same new make spirit, depending on how we mature it. So it's a wonderful example of how you can mix the nurture and the nature together to create different flavour profiles.
One of the questions we have, lots of questions have popped up now, so I think I'll share one if that's all right. Okay. Graham Fraser asks, curious who owns the SMWS now?
Well, Grant, you sound as if Graham, that you know a bit of history. We were independent. It was Pip and a few other investors who owned it up until 2004. Glenmorangie bought the society in 2004. Not long afterwards, Moët Hennessy bought Glenmorangie, so we're owned by the French for a while, and we bought ourselves back out in 2015, 6 years ago, and it's basically a group of private investors, most of whom are Scottish, but we're independent again. And it also involves some of the management team in that investment group as well.
One of the things I've noticed just by being a member is that you guys seem to be releasing some younger age statement whiskeys than you ever used to. Is that part of just the pressure of growing, or is that a...
Greg, if you look at how much that we know now compared to 30, 40 years ago about wood and the impact on flavour and how to work the spirit with the wood, it's just so it's possible now to create some great flavours earlier in the whisky's maturation period. And let's face it, for years and years and years, for decades, Scotch whisky industry told their customers that age was important, and customers got that into their head, that it was older the better. But now we're able to show that at 8 years of age, at 9 years of age, you can actually create some really great flavours because of how much we know now about the wood. When you go back to the 60s, 50s and 60s, the most malt whisky was being made for blends. I guess there wasn't that impetus so much to worry about the final taste of that cask, of these casks. It was all going to go into blends of large numbers of casks anyway. Nowadays, we know that some of the single malt is going to be sold as single malt. Some of the single malt is going to be sold as single cask. So we pay much greater attention to how these flavours are developed through maturation period.
So do you guys do a lot of like re-racking and finishes?
We've done more. People say to us, you've only started that recently. Why is that? We did our first extra maturation in 1991. Which, but it's actually developed pace since Rachel Barry. When Glenmorangie owned us and Rachel Barry encouraged us to try a little bit of extra maturation here, extra maturation there during those Glenmorangie years. We're doing more of it now. Re-racking and extra maturation just to try and manipulate the flavours so that we can actually give our members an example of different flavour profiles. So, for example, we might get a cask, a parcel of casks distilled on the same day, which we matured in different woods, and our members can taste how that new make spirit has developed differently in different casks from the same starting point.
That's really cool. I'd like to do that.
Yeah.
It's because someone was joking with me recently that eventually all independent bottlings are just going to be Kalilas.
Well, it was an interesting point. I was doing a tasting the other day there, and someone said, I was talking about Dalhuin actually, and someone said, well, if Dalhuin is so good, why don't they just bottle all a single cask? Why do they send it off to blenders? I said, because it's this balance that has to be struck between how much malt whisky required by the blenders for sale in certain parts of the world. South America is still mostly blends all over the continent, And there's some countries haven't yet come to appreciate single malt so much. So the blends, without the blends, Greg, we wouldn't have single malts.
Yeah.
But the balance is gradually changing. But I don't think it can ever change completely for the reasons I've just stated.
Speaking of the Dalhuins, I have completely a bottle I got from you guys made me completely fall in love with it recently. I remember it was called the Cherry Blossom Petit Four, and I was absolutely just blown away by that whiskey. And it's one of those ones I let sit. I kept the last inch for a while until then. I
think one of the beautiful things about the society, Greg, is that you have what you might call lesser known distilleries. And some territories abroad kind of recoil at those because we haven't heard of those. But in the society, and what they don't realise is that the blended whiskey they're drinking has that single malt in the blend. So it's a great place to start the society, to get to know more about those lesser known distilleries, to get to know about the different flavours, different types of cask provide, so that when you go to a blend or when you go to a single malt, which is a mix of cask, your palate is better educated in terms of understanding the flavours you're experiencing. So it's not, SMWS is not something to graduate to, it's a place to start.
I could see that for sure, because there's a really I was referring to it as someone recently as like a sort of concierge, where if you trust them, then you can go places you might not want to go otherwise. And then, oh, this is like, really, really suits me. I'm going to try more of this. And I never would have even thought to try it otherwise.
It's not a case of you just buy the whiskey and you drink it and that was lovely. The society is a society, a members society. So our members have got each other to meet and enjoy the whiskey with in our venues and our partner bars. We've got the website, we've got Unfiltered, the magazine, full of information about different distilleries and different whiskey aspects. So it's more than just the whiskey, although the whiskey is the most important thing, of course.
Well, have you been to Los Angeles?
Yes, I was in Los Angeles I can't remember how many years ago it was. I was the closest I've been in the last 4 or 5 years, Santa Barbara, but I was in LA probably about 10 years ago.
Well, the reason I ask is because I live very close to the Tam O'Shanter. And, I know there's no SMWS room here in LA, but that there's, events that are always held at the Tam O'Shanter, and I can almost walk there. And I know last year, right before, like maybe 2 months before the pandemic hit, Charlie McCheyne was doing an event there, and I had tickets. I was going to go, and then I was just so sick, and I just didn't go, and I was very bummed about it.
Yeah. But that's a wonderful thing, Greg. I am fond of quoting the Michael Jackson quotation, the whiskey writer, and he said as a prelude to one of his books, before he died, he said, "Scotch is the only drink in the world that you can ask for anywhere in the world by reference to the nation it comes from alone. You don't even have to add the word whiskey. You ask for a Scotch in any bar, in any city in the world, they know what you mean. Armagnac and Cognac are regions, tequila is a town, Scotch comes from the named country, Scotland. But all over the world, when I visit different countries, people regard Scotch as part of Scotland. It's part of the love they have for our country and the spirit. It's fantastic. And there are Scottish pubs, Scottish bars all over the world as well. It's fantastic.
Yeah. The head of marketing on our film, she's a friend of mine and she's Irish. And she has told me repeatedly that her father's angry at me for focusing on Scotch whiskey and not Irish whiskey. I don't think he really is.
I'll tell you a little story, Greg. Scotch is the primary source of whiskey in the world, but some people say the Irish invented it. And if you go back long enough in history, that might even be true. So when the Irish brought it over to the west coast of Scotland and introduced it to us, we had a little meeting. And we said, okay, it's not bad, but when we stop this triple distillation nonsense, we're going to just double distill, keep some of the flavour in. And the second thing we're going to do is drop the E in the word, because in Scotland, we just believe that extra vowels take up too much drinking time.
I have a couple of questions here that have popped up. I'm going to share them. Well, here we go. Some of these people, if they don't give permission to use their name, it just is going to say Facebook user. So Facebook user is asking, why did SMWS stop their membership in South Africa?
I think Facebook user that it was because of a breakdown in relationships with South African people. But guess what? Less than a month ago, I did the inaugural tasting for the new South Africa branch. So we've just reopened in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And the partner bar where it's centred is the Brothers Arms. The Brothers Arms, I think. I can't remember exactly the name, but the bar owner was there at the tasting.
Well, so the Facebook user who asked that was Juliet, who is a friend of the film and is in Johannesburg. She wrote and said that. But to be honest with you, if people are asking questions from within the Facebook group, their name doesn't appear because Facebook groups are private. But if they ask on the Facebook page, it's public. So it's just
that's fast. Good idea.
So here we go. Graham Fraser has a follow-up question again. Approximately how many casks does the SMWS have in its warehouses at any one time?
Oh, fantastic question. I can tell you that we probably, when we left Glenmorangie, we left with an agreed and chosen 5,000 casks. And despite the number that we bottled in the last 6 years, we now have double, probably getting nearly triple that number. We have casks of 130 different distilleries currently maturing in the warehouse. And we also have about 70 different cask types. So if you take the type of wood, the treatment of the wood, the previous incumbent, and all of those combinations, there's about 70 different types of cask. And if you look at the last outturn of 30 bottles or whatever, 12 different cask descriptions in that outturn. So lots more to come for you to enjoy.
Well, another Facebook user has, here we go. Do you guys visit the distilleries often to taste the cask that you bought? Do they mature at the distillery or do you have your own warehouses? I know
we have our own warehouses. We have our own warehouses. Our biggest warehouse currently is in Glasgow. But for obvious reasons, we don't keep all of our cask at the same place. No one does for obvious reasons, just in case of calamity. We also, so mostly these days, we're having our own casks filled with new make spirit and then taken it away to our warehouse to mature. But we also sometimes get offered parcels of casks, which we taste. And if we agree that the tasting panel agrees that they're good, we'll take them and we'll bottle them for our members. So there's a kind of variety of ways that we can get casks. You'll see what a recent innovation has been ultra small batch, where some distilleries have actually merged a casks which have lost whiskey due to the angel share into other casks, and we've taken some of those. They're not single cask anymore, but we've taken those because they've been so good we couldn't walk away from them. And very, very occasionally, we have a member who's bought a cask at a distillery 10 or 12 years ago. It's come time for bottling, and they've decided they actually don't want 220 bottles of that whiskey. So they actually ask us if we want to buy it back from them. We taste it, and if we like it, we'll do that. And maybe the member will take a dozen or 20 or whatever. So, but mostly these days, we are taking the new mixed spirit in our own casks back to our own warehouse. That's been a big development over the years. In earlier years, we were going to distilleries, tasting cask and taking the already matured cask, which is obviously a more expensive way to do it.
So Juliet has asked a follow-up question to that, which I think you just sort of answered. Do you buy only distillate and mature it at your warehouse? So, but I believe you've just answered that.
Basically, that's kind of what we're doing now, Juliet, yes.
That seems to be the bigger bottlers seem to be doing that more and more. Yes, like you guys and Gordon MacPhail and Cadenheads are, doing that when they can.
I think Gordon MacPhail and Cadenheads have been around for a bit longer than us, so they've been into it, for much longer than we have, and they've obviously are terrific companies with fantastic long-term historical reputations.
I've heard lots of rumors that Gordon MacPhail is going to make some crazy announcement in next month. I don't know what it is. I'm not being coy. But I've heard rumors that they.
I've heard the rumor too, so I'm waiting as you are, Greg. Yeah.
I have a personal question I want to ask you, or not personal. I mean, it's a question for me, which is there a team of people who come up with the names of your whiskeys, or is there one person who's just really funny?
The most important thing in our whole life experience of the society has been the tasting panel. We've never just accepted a cask because it's been offered to us. We've got to taste it. It has to pass a tasting panel. Now, a tasting panel a group of maybe 20 people who appear, not as 20, maybe 8 or 10 on a rota basis. And they have a chairman on the panel each time. So each panel member will smell and taste the whiskey, give their views on the flavours and whether it's good enough to be bottled. It has to pass a certain score before we'll bottle it. The chairman will take all of those comments and turn it into the note, the summary note, and give it a headline, which is supposed to reflect the flavours that might be in the glass kind of obliquely. It's supposed to be a bit of fun as well. So some of the chairmen are very well-known, famous whiskey people who are great with words. So that's why sometimes you'll get maybe a very amusing tasting note. And maybe sometimes it's more fun than indicative of the flavour itself, but we also have the flavour profile, of course, to give our members a chance to understand what they might be expecting in the glass.
I think between the names of your expressions and I think they may have stopped it now, but about 2-3 years ago, Laphroaig had the whole thing through Twitter where they would actually share like these reviews and tasting notes.
They were asking friends of Laphroaig to give their kind of summarised tasting note. Well, that was quite good fun, actually, wasn't it?
Yeah, they painted them all over the walkway of the distillery.
That's right.
It's like kissing a mermaid who had barbecue for dinner. That's the one I remember.
Laphroaig people are great.
Yeah, it's funny. I always tell people that you may not remember your first whiskey, but you'll always remember your first Laphroaig because it's just sort of, and I love it. And I know exactly where my first, I never had Laphroaig till I was 30. And my friend JP got me a bottle for my birthday. And I remember.
I was a bit younger, Greg, but Laphroaig was the first malt whiskey distiller I ever visited, as I said, back in 1983. And because of the pleasure, experience, the excitement of that whole experience, you can actually hear the whole story on the Islay Whisky Academy website. But because of the pleasure of that whole experience, it captured a place in my heart. And I can never, ever have a Laphroaig without it immediately taking me back there. I love it.
The other day there's my favorite thing about whiskey, or one of my favorite things certainly, is sometimes when you just nose it and it immediately takes you to a place, a very specific place. And 2 days ago, my business partner and I we were drinking a 27-year-old Bruichladdich. That was an independent bottling from Fault Line. K&L Wines is a wine store in California. And as soon as I nosed this, I was immediately back shooting the film. I was in the warehouse with Jim McEwen because this is the warehouse where that most likely, spent its entire life. And pre-Jim McEwen, this thing was distilled in 91. So it took me right there.
Jim McEwen told me a couple of years ago that when he was traveling the world extensively, as he was for a long time, and after another tasting in another location on another evening, and he got back to his hotel and he was feeling a little bit exhausted and perhaps homesick, he would have a glass of Laphroaig or Beaumont or Bruichladdich and he'd be right back in Islay again.
Have you ever heard him tell the version of that story about the hurricane?
I think so.
He was in a hotel in Miami, and the only whiskey he recognized was Laphroaig, and he got a double pour and went to his room, and then he went on the balcony and smoked a cigar. And a hurricane was coming in, and he said, "I don't care. I'm just going to sit here." And he sat there until the cigar went out in the rain.
So Jim, isn't it? So Jim.
Yeah. So Juliet had another follow-up question to that, which I think is interesting. Why not do it the traditional way and mature it at the warehouse at the distillery? Is it in order to keep character and DNA?
Well, the reason we do that is because what we're trying to do is effectively create our own whiskey from the new make spirit. If we, by taking the spirit from distillery and maturing it in different types of cask ourselves, we can create a range of flavours for our members. If we were just buying the same new make spirit matured in ex-bourbon barrels from the same distillery all the time, we probably couldn't get that extensive range of flavour. So it's about us being whiskey makers rather than just bottlers. Really, that's what it's about. There's so much of the flavour, as you know, Juliet, comes from the maturation. As I said before, there's the nature and there's the nurture. So much of the flavour comes from the nurture, and we really want to be leaders in that in terms of creating those flavours. And that's why we've extended over the last few years into extra maturation and blended malts and that kind of thing.
It's interesting. Is one of the things you find that some distilleries that are built, Caol Ila is a perfect example, is it's purpose built. It's, in case anyone doesn't know, it is one of the main ingredients of Johnnie Walker Black, and that is what it is there for. That is what its distillate is made for. That is all decisions are made with that road. So then there's so many independent bottlings that come out of Caol Ila, and you can see the things that could be done with it. The Diageo, no, I'm not knocking Diageo. They just don't. That's just not why they have it. That's not what they want to do with it. But it can go in so many places that it doesn't go normally in any official bottling, and never would. They're not going to do some kind of big crazy wood program on a distillate that's going to wind up in Johnnie Walker Black. It's just.
That's right, Greg. I just think that we as malt whiskey lovers have to, I think, bear in mind that we exist really because of the blends, and there are some fantastic blends out there. I mean, you mentioned Johnnie Walker Black there, Greg. I just think that's a terrific whiskey, and we have to, so I know some people tend to kind of look down on blended whiskey, and really that's not the thing to be doing. It's to be appreciate that why it exists. If we stop doing blended whiskey tomorrow, and try to sell all of our whiskey as single malt and single grain, then I'm afraid that there'd be a bit of a collapse.
Yeah, for sure. This isn't a question, it's just a comment from Doug McRae. Hello from upstate New York. This is wonderful. Well, thank you, Doug.
Okay, Doug.
So one more question that on this line of questioning is, so many bottlers have started distilleries now, or sometimes vice versa. Do you ever see the SMWS doing that?
Starting our own distillery so far isn't on the horizon, but we may be working more closely with distillers in terms of creating new make spirit that we can then take away and mature. But, watch this space on that one. But I don't think there's any plans to actually be the owners of a distillery at the moment.
Well, you have to forgive me that I know you were in the panel we did with Jim last month, and so we discussed it briefly there. You may have heard me say it, but we're one of the things that we're working on, or hoping to work on, when we're allowed to really go work in earnest again, is making an entire sort of secondary film about independent bottlers and the history of bottling in Scotland. And I know that one of the people that's been one of the producers and cameramen that's works with us is outside of Edinburgh, and he worked on the original film, and he's kind of our camera that's already in Scotland. So he's already done a couple of interviews. I know he's been in touch about talking to Pip, and I know that I mentioned to you I wanted to talk to you as well on camera. Well, not that we're not on camera now, but you know what I mean.
For sure. I know what you mean.
Because I really think that it's a unique thing, bottling. People, bottlers or independent whiskey makers, small or large. It's I can't come up with a comparison in any other industry. There's certainly no food or wine equivalent or beer equivalent. I know spirits is really it, as far as I can tell.
I think Greg, that's a great comment, because I'm a very proud Scotsman, and I am very proud of Scotch, our whiskey industry. And I just think that people I talk to all over the world, as I said before, just think of Scotch as being part of Scotland, and the appreciation of Scotch kind of gives them a little bit of Scotland. And millions of people love to visit Scotland and visit distilleries and find out more about it. And I've been in foreign countries where some people have visited parts of Scotland that I haven't been in yet. It's incredible. I was actually in Japan a couple of years ago, and I was doing a tasting, and I saw the corner of my eye. There was a fella there kind of frantically flicking through this notebook and nudging his friend. So I kind of said to him, "What is it? Something interesting there?" He said, "I visit Scotland." He had a Glasgow accent as well, by the way. He said, I visit Scotland all the time, and I visit distilleries, and I take notes of the date I was there and all about the distillery. And I was there on the day this whiskey was distilled, because on our bottle it gives the exact distillation date. I thought that's incredible. A huge round of applause for the chap. He was so excited. He wanted to buy a case, but I didn't have a case to give him. I think we eventually got away with 3 bottles or something. But I just thought it's fantastic. It meant he was so attached to Scotland through this particular bottle of Scotch. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because we've done a lot of work on this film already. This second film, which doesn't have a title yet, but it's one of the things that is so interesting to me is how bottling grew out of grocers, but so did a lot of other whiskey. Johnny Walker was a grocer, and Tommy Dewar. They could have easily become independent bottlers. And it was all about this ability to get consistent product and everything. But then they became and I think to this day are the most creative people in the industry. The bottlers have an opportunity to do things that a giant ship like a Pernod Ricard isn't going to be able to do on a whim. But they could say, oh, sure, this is one cask. Let's finish this in a Calvados cask. Or, they can just go off and try something. And
that's absolutely right, Greg. And also the other thing is that as the appreciation of single malt and single cask, single malt grows and grows, we just need to hope that the distilleries can keep up with demand. We're talking about the balance between blends and single malts. At the moment, we're quite lucky because a very small proportion of whiskey drinkers in the world are focused on single malt and single cask, single malt. So as that grows and grows, let's hope that they can keep it coming. But let's not forget, you mentioned Johnny Walker. 200 years of Johnny Walker last year, and Dr. Nick Morgan has written a book, The Long Stride, on that, and it's a fantastic story. You're right. They were all just grocers at one point in time, taking casks and bottling from casks or stone jugs or whatever. The development of Scotch whisky through the centuries is a fantastic story. And let's face it, it's not stopped yet. It's going to keep on going, and there'll be innovations. And the Scotch Whisky Association keeps quite a good grip on the provenance of Scotch. Doesn't allow things which will start to nibble away at the edges of what it is. Mm-hmm. Some countries don't have those kind of regulations. Some countries are thinking about putting regulations in. But at least with Scotch, you always know that the basic rules are there to protect what it is you're actually drinking.
And I think people sometimes don't even realize some of these grocers back then. Not only, Tommy Dewar, you could argue, made the first ever commercial.
Yeah.
They really invented the idea of advertising and marketing in a modern way. And one of the things that we're looking into doing as well is trying to develop a sort of a historical series about the people who took Scotch whiskey out of Scotland, about like Buchanan and Tommy Dewar and Alexander Walker and some of these guys that were really instrumental in.
I think it's also worth bearing in mind, Greg, as well, that between the Act of Union in 1707 and the beginning of the First World War, there's 1.5 to 2 million Scots emigrated. Some were forced off the land by something which is called the Highland Clearances, if somebody don't know. So those Scots who left took some things with them. They took a love of Robert Burns, which is why Robert Burns is so well known right across the world, but they also took a love of Scotch whisky. And that helped to actually spread the word about Scotch whisky around the globe.
I didn't research this, so this could be wrong, but I just saw last week that they said that if you look at there's a handful of bourbon distilleries in Kentucky here that spell whiskey without the E. And if you look at them, the ones that don't use the E are all Scottish immigrants. They were all founded by Scottish immigrants who. That's right.
You're absolutely spot on there, Greg. It's a nod to their heritage. Mm-hmm. They don't use the E.
We're going to wrap this up in a couple of minutes. As I do every week, I go over time. But I do have an interesting question popped up from someone watching on our YouTube channel right now. So I'm going to put up John's question here.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. As more countries are making whiskey and the society are bottling them for the society, I have a worry the society would be named the World Malt Whisky Society. I guess not so much a question as a comment, but it's still an interesting one.
I'll tell you what, John, it's a good question. I get asked it quite a lot, actually. But I think that what we are doing at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is by doing these world whiskies, we're trying to give our members the chance to explore and the aromas and the flavours without having to go elsewhere. They read about them and see them on television about the world whiskies. So we're giving them the chance to try. But what we will always mainly be about is Scotch whisky, although we'll have these other parts. But I agree, in the last few years, there have been a lot of world whisky bottlings, but there'll be a lot more Scotch whisky coming through, new Scotch distilleries coming through. So we'll always major on Scotch whisky.
Just the other day, I saw that North Star released an independent bottling from Glasgow Distillery, which is where I worked before we shot the film. And I took a pause for a moment. I thought, oh, this could be what I did for the 5 days. I only worked there 5 days.
Can you imagine what a fantastic thing that would be, Greg, if that was the case? That would be that chap in Japan. Yes.
Well, what I did the first day was mash in, and then the final day I filled 12 casks that I had basically followed that spirit throughout the week. And so those 12, then last few months ago, I bought one of those casks. They helped me go source. There were Alphonse, our one producer, had taken photos of me filling the cask. So we looked up the photos and found the cask numbers, and then they found one. So I actually bought a cask of whiskey that I made. Fantastic.
Well, that is a dream. That is a dream, isn't it? Yeah.
But this could be my first foray into independent. Well, not that cask, the one that North Star released. So I want to thank you so much for this. This has been awesome. And we didn't even get to the whole number coding system, which I was going to bring up, which I'm sure everyone brings up. Oh, nice.
I'm happy to talk about the coding system, Greg, if you've got time.
Yeah, okay, yeah, if you want to. We put a thing on our website. We have a blog on our website, and a few weeks ago, one of our producers wrote a blog about it. And because I'm really curious, specifically in the number coding system, to talk about every take a Gordon and MacPhail. They'll have bottles it'll say where it was distilled, and bottles it'll say Highland whiskey. And I realize those are kind of related to the number system, where it's sort of the deal you make with a distillery. But can you give us a quick primer on that before we wrap this up?
Back in 1983, when we started, the first cask came from Glenfarclas. Now, when Pip went to Glenfarclas and said, "I made an agreement to take this cask away," the Grant said, "Well, wait a minute. If you bottle that as Glenfarclas customers will be a bit confused because it won't taste like our Glenfarclas. Our Glenfarclas is a mix of casks, so it can be consistent every time. Yours will be unique." So Pip said, "What about a numbering system?" So Glenfarclas was distillery number 1, and the very first cask we bottled was number 1.1. Would you believe 2 years ago we had a tasting at the Vaults with Pip? And from the archive, we brought a bottle of 1.1 and we tasted it. Fantastic. So after that, every distillery we got the number in the order they came from. So number 2 was Glenlivet, number 3 was Bowmore, blah, blah. We're now up to 149 or something. And the number after the dot is the number of casks we've had from that distillery over the years. So 53.233 would be the 233rd cask from Calida. Now, up until the internet came along, we used to give our members little kind of geographical and stylistic clues as to where a distillery was. What we wanted them to focus on was the flavour, not a preconceived idea of what the flavour would be based on the proprietary bottle they tasted last week. Okay, Then the internet came along, and now you can look it up, easy. So everybody knows. But we keep up the numbering system as part of our DNA for that reason, to try and allow the members not to think about what it will taste like because there's a name on the bottle, but just for the flavour itself, So that's why we do that.
Well, that's great. That's a perfect description. Much better than I could have ever done. So. Well, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate this, and I really hope I can talk to you more on camera, on a better camera than this,
sure.
for this other film.
Pleasure, Greg. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. And I don't have a glass. I think I mentioned to you, but I didn't say at the beginning of this, is I got my second vaccine shot last afternoon. And so I'm okay today, but I don't want to drink today because I'm afraid it'll take my legs out from under me.
I'm having a wee drop of vaccine right now.
It's a belter. Well, anyway, thank you so much, John. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your stories. And one thing I want to bring up on the screen here before we go is this is a link. We're doing events tomorrow. We're doing a thing 3 times called the Bruichladdich, People of Bruichladdich, and we're going to 3 Saturdays over the next 6 weeks. We're going to do live chats after people see the film with different people from the Bruichladdich distillery. So tickets are on sale at that link right there. So, and at that point, I will say farewell to everyone. I'll see you all next Friday. Next Friday, I'm going to be joined with the women from the Dram Fine podcast. We'll put a link up about that tomorrow. So
great stuff. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks
everybody who's been looking in.
Bye.
Bye-bye.